even if that is the case, it's still the case that there is such a thing as the moral law of which we are conscious. Oh, yeah, yes.
That basically Muslim says that it changed based on the interpretations. It's basically Muslims do really believe that the doctrines related to society really differed. So they basically think that at least it was true that divorce was not accepted in Christianity and it was accepted in Islam. It's not something that was played by the priests. Muslims do believe in playing by the priests when it comes, for example, to who God is, but not in society matters. So, and with Judaism, Islam took a lot from Judaism. Despite this, Islam redefined a lot of things within Judaism, which makes it seem that God really believes that morality is not universal. Okay, but I don't think as well that God believes that when he gives Islam a final decree that it would be universal to every single society and every single tradition that will ever occur since Islam starts, which contradicts the same way of thinking God would have had with establishing Judaism and Christianity, which means that God possibly doesn't really enforce a manuscript to whoever forever will lead in a certain society. It seems like God wants to teach us that there is some sort of flexibility, especially that most moral codes within Judaism fits within the Jewish community, and Christianity fits within the medieval understanding of a family, for example. And within Islam, it fits with the Arab understanding of family that existed before Islam. It's not the same, but at least it fits, which means that it is not universal, or it should not be universal afterwards. That's one question. That's one comment. Concerning the question related to Kant, it seems to me hilarious that Kant really starts with the assumption that whatever is rational is free, and whatever is animalistic is unfree. I think it's a very large presumption. So how do you define something as being free just for being rational? How could it be that rationality is equal to freedom somehow? I'm not saying that it is not, I'm just saying that it's a presumption. The first thing, you need to prove that rationality is equal to freedom. The second thing has to do with the understanding of animals that Kant have. And actually, it's not Kant that developed that understanding. It actually exists before Kant.
Oh, yes, yeah.
That animals are basically unfree and they go after their animalistic instincts, and that's it. But maybe because animals don't have the same structure of society in which there is right and wrong, and if they had the reasons not to do an action, they would not do it, but they don't have a reason not to do it. So, for example, if you live in a society in which there is nothing good or bad about eating meat, you might eat it or might not eat it, and probably you will eat it. But if you do not live in that if you live in another society in which there is an idea about eating meat being wrong, you'll be in a moral conflict in which you will either eat meat or not, and you'll have moral standards. But what if animals do not have the conception of what they are doing being right or wrong? Maybe if they think that it is wrong, they won't do it. Maybe they don't have that reason not to do the actions, because some animals we know do not do certain actions because they do not fit within the rules of their, for example, elephants. It's very rare that an elephant within a group of elephants would disagree with the elder elephant. There is some sort of a leadership. So it seems that animals might have reasons not to be acting this way, not to be bound by not doing what we think is wrong. But maybe they have freedom. It's a bit of a bridge over the problem of other minds, I think.
Okay. Well, actually, can you hear me for this one? I was speaking for that. I mean, I would say actually I think that the question really is, do human beings have freedom of the will at all? So, I mean, in one sense, I would be reluctant to kind of extend freedom of the will, as you seem to do, to the animal kingdom. Now, I mean, admittedly, this conception of animal life, which I came up with here, where was it? I mean, to some extent, this is, it does have a long tradition. It has a tradition in Descartes, where Descartes said that animals were complicated machines, and that only human beings are free, and therefore, because only human beings have souls. Now, in one sense, the debate really within philosophy, since Descartes made that point, since Descartes made this huge sort of metaphysical division between the animal kingdom on the one hand, which were just complicated machines, which were just essentially like automata, and had no freedom of the will whatsoever, and human beings, which were rational and had souls, and therefore we were, so to speak, under the influence of a spiritual component, which was not subject to the laws of cause and effect of the physical universe. The question really has been, is that correct, or is it rather the case that in actual fact it's us who are just like animals, but not just like animals because animals are free, but rather we're just like animals because we actually don't have freedom of the will either. Now, Kant is somebody who offers a very very in-depth discussion about this kind of this issue regarding freedom of the will. Now, he seems to think that I think basically myself, I would say that the only real defense that there can be of freedom of the will is a Kantian one. I think in actual fact that he's actually, I'm not 100% sure that I would even completely and utterly endorse it, but I think if I would endorse any conception of free will whatsoever, it would be a Kantian conception of free will, which I would endorse. And I mean, effectively, first of all, he is saying that rationality does give us a certain sense of freedom, what he refers to as practical freedom, simply because we can be motivated by, our actions can be motivated by things for which animal actions cannot possibly be motivated whatsoever. So animals can only be motivated by some kind of sensory stimuli. The dog who is trying to choose whether to run after the female dog or whether to go back to its master, well, in that moment of choice, it's completely and utterly motivated by sensory stimuli, and basically which one it chooses, which option it chooses. In choosing, it's really very much like weights upon a scale. Precisely that which that motive that the dog decides the most is the one which it's going to choose. So if the dog desires reproducing more than it desires the affection of its master, then it will run after the female dog. If, on the other hand, through training and through conditioning, the dog has been conditioned to fear its master, or it's been conditioned to always expect a nice biscuit when it does what the master commands, well, in that case, the dog will run to the master. But in both cases, it's the desire for pleasure that is motivating the dog's behavior, and also the objects that are motivating the dog's behavior are sensible, in the sense of perceptible objects present precisely within the here and now, within the present. Now, when human beings act, on the other hand, we of course also are often subject to our desires for pleasure, and of course we're subject to our actions are often motivated by what we see. If for instance the doors had opened just then and it wasn't Khadija but it was somebody who'd come in with a gun and was pointing it at my head, well, probably that would be a sufficient motivation for me to dive under the table. So we precisely in our own self-interest, out of our own egoism, our desire for pleasure, we are frequently determined by sensible motives like animals. But the very fact that we can actually sometimes be motivated to do things that are not in our interests and do not cause us pleasure, at least they don't seem to be within our interests as far as this life and the here and now are concerned, and they certainly don't cause us pleasure within this life, and yet we can nonetheless be motivated to do them, or at least we can be conscious that we ought to do them. That, as far as Kant is concerned, is, well, that's so to speak the moment of negative freedom, in which we can be conscious of the fact that we are very different from animals insofar as we are not simply and utterly motivated, and our behavior is not simply and utterly conditioned by sensible sensory stimuli. And we can rip ourselves apart from this, away from this sensory conditioning, and we can be motivated, therefore, by purely abstract ideas or purely abstract duties. Now, that is precisely, a freedom in the sense that it's freedom from something. Now, okay, that's what Kant therefore means, by practical freedom. But then, he thinks, well, what is it that makes this practical freedom, this moment of negative freedom possible? Well, it's the moral law, which is generated by human reason. And precisely our reason is therefore free in the sense that it really is, it is transcendently free. In the sense that it's not in any sense conditioned by the world around us, that the laws of cause and effect within the world. And precisely in imposing the moral law, there is this moment of transcendental freedom. So in that sense, the moral law is imposed upon us, it's imposed upon our minds by something that is not part of the world. It's not a natural cause. It's an uncaused cause. It's a first cause. It's completely spontaneous. The understanding or the reason of man, the moral understanding of man, is completely and utterly spontaneous, and therefore it's the product of free will. And the very fact that happens gives us this awareness of moral laws, and therefore gives us this capacity to overcome our animalistic nature and to not simply be determined by the available sensory motives which we see.
According to Kant, we should never lie. it's a moral duty to always tell the truth, right? Well, I want to consider this problem. It's a little bit like the false testimony one, but a little bit different, okay? Well, let's say I have a wife, and she had made for me this dinner or something, okay? And she really wants to know my opinion on it, okay? And it is awful, okay? And she asks me, what do you think? So, because I don't want to hurt her feelings, I lie and I say, darling, it is delicious and something like this. So by this, I'm not treating her like a means, and actually I'm doing this because of morality. So doesn't this contradict with Kant's saying that what is moral is the same at all times?
Okay, well, I mean, what you raised there is a very, very famous objection. Well, in actual fact, there were other even more extreme famous objections about what Kant says about never lying being a moral duty, and it's being our duty to always tell the truth. What I'd suggest to you, however, which is why I've gone back to this particular slide, is that probably, in this particular case, that your wife has made you dinner and asks for your opinion, and in actual fact, it tastes awful, but you say, it's delightful. Well, perhaps, basically you're being motivated there by what Kant would refer to as a pragmatic rule of prudence, because, and you're motivated therefore by a desire for happiness. On the one hand, you're motivated that your wife be happy, but you're probably motivated by a desire that you yourself would be happy. If you did tell her the truth, she'd throw the dinner in your face. I don't know, but in that sense, Kant would say that would be perfectly willing to admit that there are certain examples in which it is very, very prudent to tell a lie. But it's still never going to be moral. But it's a good example of how Kant thinks as well that frequently those people who are absolutely moral, the most moral people are the people who are unhappy, because I tell you, you go around never lying and constantly telling the truth to everybody, you're soon going to be very unpopular, perhaps. I mean, at least certainly in this life. But there's. I mean, it's still the case. Kant would say that you've still got a duty to tell the truth all the time, and he says that you owe it to humanity as a whole to tell the truth all the time, and that if you do lie about anything, that you are responsible for the consequences. Well, what could be terrible consequences of you lying to your wife about this meal? Well, she could think that her cooking really is really great, and that this thing that she's cooked is really fantastic, and so she keeps cooking it and she keeps serving it to many, many different people. All of the distant relatives get invited to dinner, and they all have to eat the same dish, and they all dislike it, but they're all too polite to say anything. Well, if that were the case, who would be responsible for that state of affairs? You would be the one who would be responsible for the state of affairs. So you'd have to carry that on your shoulders. So, in that sense, there is perhaps, potentially within every lie, there is always the capacity that, even if you think it's a white lie and you're lying just so as to avoid somebody's feelings being hurt, there's always the possibility that unfortunate consequences will follow from that. And if that is the case, you are the one who's responsible for it. And, you have to shoulder the blame for that. I mean, the very, very famous example, which a similar one, but a slightly more severe one, is the case of you harbouring somebody within your house who is being pursued by a murderer who wants to kill this person. And the killer, or the potential killer, knocks upon your door and says, is that person in your house? To which Kant says, the right thing to do is to say yes. Even within that circle, if you are asked a question for which you simply cannot possibly lie, you've got to give a yes or no answer, then Kant says, you have to always tell the truth. And he sort of dodges around. He confronts the objection. I mean, because this was the objection. The objection of somebody being raised as somebody being pursued by a murderer was specifically raised in order to try and refute Kant's theory. But quite late at the end of his life, Kant explicitly confronted this objection and said, no, it really is the case. The murderer knocks on your door and says, are you hiding that person within your apartment? You should tell the truth. Why? Well, you said you could, and he is very clever at finding a potential counter argument where, in actual fact, lying, even in that scenario, really might be an appealing thing to do, because he suggests, okay, well, just imagine that you lie and you say, no, that person isn't my apartment. What happens? The murderer then goes away, still looking for this person upon the street. But unbeknown to you, as your back was turned, the person that you were hiding within the apartment has left the apartment, and then the murderer meets that person and they get murdered, and then who's responsible for it? Well, you are, because you told the lie. So it really is a slightly contorted response to the objection. But nonetheless, Kant explicitly says that you should never lie. If you do lie, any consequences, unpleasant consequences that follow from that lie, are purely your responsibility, and also you do a disservice to the whole of humanity by lying. By lying, you sin against the whole of humanity. Yeah.
Why doesn't Kant just say, when he's replying, why doesn't he just say, well, maybe there's another rule that you should follow, which is maybe a rule like always protect innocent people from harm. So maybe that's a more important rule to follow. Why doesn't he say that?
Well, I suppose, it could be the case that, there are, of course, duties that are perfect and some that are imperfect. And I guess, if you say that, benefiting others is for Kant an imperfect duty which permits exceptions, whereas lying just happens to be deduced as or not lying, constantly being honest, happens to be a perfect duty. And of course that might make, again, actually perhaps in actual fact there is a problem of application here. I concede that point to the
then we would have to get into
the first questioner. But in terms of that, the deduction itself and the categorical imperative, it makes absolutely perfect sense as to why lying is something that can't be permitted under any circumstances, whereas benefiting others, it does permit of exceptions. In one sense, the person hiding somebody in your apartment from a murderer is certainly a moral thing to do. It's a good thing to do. It's a moral thing to do. But at the same time, also, telling the truth about their location when the murderer comes knocking on the door, that's also a moral thing to do. And in one sense, Kant would say because honesty is a perfect duty and benefiting others is an imperfect duty, then the command that you should always tell the truth is more important than the command that you should always benefit others.
Yeah, I just think it's weird because all philosophers, well, not all, but many philosophers prior to Kant just took protecting innocent people from harm as the most categorical, universal rule that you have to follow at all. So anyway, but I have another question. Okay, this is just, my question is, okay, so Kant thinks that I can have an idea of what's good and bad, and then I can, because I have this idea of what's good and bad, end up with an idea of what God is like, that God exists, and have some kind of basic idea of what God is like.
Yeah.
But he would say, I can't start with an idea of what God is like and then use that to come up with an idea of what is good and what's bad.
Yes. Yeah.
In other words, I can base my concept of God on my concept of morality, but I can't base my morality on my concept of God.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Can you just explain for us one more time? Why not?
Oh, why not? Okay,
Yeah.
we could go with this, the quotation in a bit more detail then. Okay, so what does Kant say then about the divine command theory of ethics? Well, we've got these two quotations here. No. Well, first of all, okay, as he says, let's take a look at the second quotation. Okay, well, we can't intuit divine perfection. So, in other words, you can't have, at least in this life, you can't have an immediate awareness of God to know what he's like. He's not sort of an object of immediate awareness forwards. So, in that sense, it really does not. If something is unintuitable, if it's not an object within the world which we can perceive, then, how exactly are we meant to derive any properties from it? Well, sure enough, we could think about it, but, if we are thinking about it, this unintuitable thing, which cannot be an object of immediate consciousness, well, we're obviously the ones who are framing the concept. We're the ones who are coming up with the idea within our heads. And sure enough, we say that such a being is omnibenevolent. But in order to say that the being is omnibenevolent, well, we must have had an idea of benevolence or goodness within the first place. It's not, because God is therefore unintuitable, we can't derive our morality from God without essentially being guilty of circular reasoning. So, as he continues, I'll just finish. So, he says, we cannot intuit divine perfection, but can only derive it from our own concepts, among which morality is foremost. And also, if morality is derived from a divine and most perfect will, and being thus derived would involve a crudely circular explanation, then the only remaining concepts of God's will is drawn from such characteristics as desire for glory and dominion, combined with such frightful representations as those of might and vengeance. Any system of morals based upon such notions would be directly opposed to morality. And so basically, it's one or the other. I mean, basically, you either say that the proponent of the divine command theory of ethics is saying that the proponent of the divine command theory is either committed to a kind of circularity in which they think, yes, there's a really perfectly good being who commands what we should do, and those commands are perfectly moral, so they're really good, and we really, really should do them. But, the person who's saying that is guilty of this circularity because they've arrived at the concept of God, a perfectly good being in the first place, only because they have a previous conception of moral goodness. And they couldn't have arrived at the concept of God's moral perfection unless they had a previous concept of morality. So, however, could be the case. Well, if the proponent of the divine command theory, really says that, that's not what I'm doing. Basically, I'm just saying that there is a God, and anything that God wills is good. Well, basically, then it's simply the case that our morality is simply the product of an arbitrary whim. It could be the case that God could change his mind, and all of a sudden, tomorrow it happens to be the case that God wills that innocent people are tortured. And, if that were the case, then we'd have to say that the torturing of innocent people is moral. But, surely that seems to be absurd. And so it's not simply the case, as Kant says in the first quotation here on the first line, it's not simply the case that moral laws can be regarded as contingent and derived from a mere will. It must be the case that particular actions are willed by God for a reason. And they're willed by God for a reason because they're good, because they're moral. But therefore, that therefore makes it absolutely necessary that the morality is something that is completely independent of God, determined from another source.